Hi, and welcome to F-Roll, the Fragility podcast. Together with our guests, we explore how the forces of fragility manifest across the world and in our day-to-day lives, and how we can build a more resilient future. I'm Mihaela Karstay, and I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Johan Bjurman-Bergman and Paul Beska. And today, we are delighted to welcome back Seth Kaplan. Seth is a professorial lecturer at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, a senior advisor for the Institute for Integrated Transitions, and a consultant to organizations such as the World Bank, USAID, State Department, and the OECD. And most recently, he is a visiting fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. But his roles only tell you part of the story. Seth has decades of experience working to prevent conflict in fragile states, and more recently, Seth turned his attention to the U.S. and to the fragility we feel close to home. So today, we're talking about Seth's new book, Fragile Neighborhoods, Repairing American Society One Zip Code at a Time. Welcome back, Seth.
Thank you so much.
So you have focused, as I said, we've previously spoken, and I encourage everybody to go back and watch that episode, which was absolutely fascinating, and it covered all of your international experience and history. So now we want to start from there, and you focused your entire professional career on fragile states. How is that relevant for the U.S. today? What tools or perspectives does it bring to your most recent endeavor?
I would frame it slightly differently. When I was young, so to speak, right out of college, I was a wanderer, and I wandered place to place. And after lived in Africa, lived in Asia, lived in the Middle East, of course, took the backpack through Europe at some point. And the question that stuck in my mind during this wandering, reading, reflecting, was why are some countries working better than others? And I mean, I focused eventually on lots of fragile states, but I never kept my eye off the globe, all the countries. And the answer to my question was, there's something about the relationships. There's something about the social dynamics that determine how successful a country will be. That's most obvious if you think of Nigeria, or you think about Somalia, or you think about Syria or Libya. But I think it's equally true for France, Germany, United States, Japan. And so even when I'm working on fragile states, and my focus has always been is what about the nature of relationships? What about the nature of institutions that will make these states less conflict prone, more stable, more developmental, more able to help their people advance? I'm still focused on the same set of questions that when people ask me about the United States, 2015, 2016, and you can guess the reasons why they were asking me, is the United States fragile? I just took the same set of questions about relationships, about institutions, about social dynamics and how they affected politics and everything else. I simply took the questions and brought them to a new context. And I think many of the problems or challenges that developed countries face, including the UK, including France, including the United States and elsewhere, is also something about the relationships in society, whether it's local or whether it's between different parts of the country. The same type of thing I would see wherever I go in the world.
So what do these kind of fragile dynamics and relationships look like then? What if I were to step into a neighborhood, how would I see that it's fragile? What's the symptoms that stand out most? If I were to walk around in DC and suddenly I cross the street, and then what do I see if I step into one of these fragile neighborhoods?
So first, maybe I'll take a step back and think about how do I think of fragility? Most people think of fragility in a very technical matter. They're thinking, what is not working in this country? So you get all these lists of the ministries aren't working, the government isn't working, there's corruption, and so it's very technical. The education level isn't high enough, something wrong with the infrastructure, what have you. So you can find lots of people working on fragility or conflict prevention or things related to fragility. It could be humanitarian, it could be in the economic developmental sphere, but we're working on a set of countries, a set of issues, and we too often think about it technically, or we too often think about it as a series of material problems. Now, I think of fragility from the beginning in a very different manner. I always have thought about fragility in terms of relationships. The success or failure of a country ultimately is about the nature of relationships. We're taught that states work or don't work because of institutions, but I ask everyone to go a step before that. What are institutions? They are based upon the relationships that people have with each other. So if we think about relationships, then we think about institutions, formal and informal, and then we think how countries work. So going back to your question, I think in the fragile states, you tend to walk around and you often see thriving communities, thriving neighborhoods. And what that means is strong families, strong interfamily relationships, a lot of social activities in the streets, in the local shops, and so on and so forth. I mean, that's just the things you might see. There's much more than that. But then if you go to the national level, you'll see that they're often divided between different groups, ethnic, religious, geographic, clan. I mean, it varies place to place, but you don't have the types of relationships of trust, the type of cohesion, the type of bridging mechanism, institutions that will bring people together to work together to a common end. If you go to the United States, and this is where I ended up with neighborhoods, United States, and I would say other developed countries, they work generally very well at the national level. I mean, the United States has a government that, for all of its flaws, and it does have flaws, it does have dysfunction in Congress, it does have state institutions which are, I would say, somewhat stale, a bit slow, lethargic, and so on, bureaucratic. It works, and it's worked for decades, if not much longer. It depends how you want to date the age of the federal government. And then you have states, and then you have a very dynamic civil society, and then you have these incredibly dynamic companies. But if you go to the local level, you see a great decay in relationships. You see everything from family breakdown to household instability. You see people who live in the same neighborhood and never talk to each other. And I'll just draw a contrast. I was speaking to someone yesterday, a professor at NYU working in the urban area, and she was just explaining that she, by accident, I was speaking to her for a completely different reason, but talking about this idea of neighborhoods. She explained that when she first moved to NYU, she found a place to live about an hour away in the middle of no place in Connecticut. They were going to spend a year there and then move on. But what they discovered was a thriving place, neighborhood. Partly because it was cut off from other areas, a little isolated, but a thriving neighborhood versus a fragile neighborhood. A thriving neighborhood, people have deep, and I see it in my neighborhood, people have deep relationships with each other. They know personal details about each other. Their kids play with each other. They're in civic associations. They're in schools. They're in the shopping. They're on the street. They're in the playground. They're visiting people's homes. There's thick bonds, and there's overlapping institutions where people meet. They meet for a purpose, and they often meet without a purpose. They meet spontaneously. And there's a certain amount of joy and a certain amount of excitement and a certain amount of flourishing that pervades people's lives because they're in a flourishing place. And it affects so many other things which we can talk about. If you're in a fragile neighborhood, that could mean either a poor place that's isolated, a lot of instability at the family household level, not very good institutions, and people might support each other, but everything is very weak, everything is very fragile, and opportunity is limited. But you could also be in a materially very well-off neighborhood, and nobody will know each other. Everything is solved through the phone, through the app, through spending money. And if you have a crisis, all you know to do is to go to a hospital or go to your app. You don't have anybody in your immediate neighborhood that you have any relationship on that you can depend on.
So you've alluded to this already, but tell us just briefly why you wrote the book. And then perhaps we can touch upon this relationship between, I mean, you've talked earlier about the fact that in fragile states you have these thriving communities, thriving families, but somehow they don't make it to the national level. What stops that process ultimately? Because yes, you can have these neighborhoods, but they are still poor. Many of them, I mean, they have kids who could join armed groups, and so on. It's not exactly it's thriving for survival, but not necessarily the thriving to grow in a way. So, what are your reflections on these topics? But tell us first a bit though. Why the book? Why now?
Okay, I think there's two questions there.
Yeah.
Okay, why the book is, well, first of all, I personally, my life is dedicated to this problem of relationships, the problem of society, and the problem of how those things affect the trajectory of countries. That is, it wasn't something I woke up one morning and said, this is what I'm going to spend my life on. It was basically traveling, wandering, asking, looking at country after country. And after I had 20, 30 countries of data in my head, and basically reading everything from Aristotle to World Bank publications. And this is the question that stuck in my head that I thought was missing and needed attention and was very important and yet very not well understood and not incorporated into anyone's thinking. Yet to me, it was the all-powerful lens to understand everything else. So I started with this premise, and then in 2015, 2016, people asked me, and I'm from the United States, I grew up in this country. I've been aware since I was in high school of, I would just say the nature of relationships was never this is personal. I was never very pleased by the nature of relationships. And that's probably one of the reasons why when I traveled a little bit in college, and then I had the chance after college, what do? I immediately set out for what were the warmest cultures on earth. That's basically what I did. I decided to wander, and I wandered to places where I felt relationships were the types of relationships that I appreciated. And I felt somehow relationships at home were cold and distant and not very supportive. And so I had this very personal reason for actually enjoying my time in poor countries, because I very much like the types of relationships and the way people treated each other. So I have that personal reason, but then again, professionally, I spent 15 years working on fragile states, and then people asked me, and I myself had in my head, what is it about the United States that has always left me with that feeling that something is missing? And then basically, I didn't know how to answer the question, why is the U.S. fragile? So I dedicated several years of my time to basically going around and interviewing people, visiting places. I actually organized for more than 4 years a social capital luncheon in Washington in partnership with 2 other people or 3 other people. One person was mostly absent. And we were able to bring in people from think tanks. We were able to bring in practitioners, and that I built the network and I built knowledge, and I eventually went to visit people and hear what they had to say. So that's where, from that learning, is where I landed on neighborhoods, and I landed on not the national relationships, even though, of course, those also matter, but I think those are downstream from what is happening in terms of social decay, and I use that term on purpose, social decay, or social breakdown is Emil Durkheim, the term that he would use, and how that is affecting many other things in the society, from deaths of despair to rising suicide to rising teenage depression to alienation to ultimately more polarized politics. So, I mean, I started with the question is, what's wrong with America? And people were asking about the polarization or the rise of Trump. And I landed on this problem is that those issues are symptoms or products of something that's upstream that's going on. And in terms of your second question, I think the big difference is to build a successful country, you ultimately need institutions nationally that are impersonal, autonomous, widely legitimate across groups, and effective. And in a country that's cohesive and has some sort of organic evolution, which is often violent, think of European history, and Tilly has this, the famous phrase is, the state made war and war made the state. I mean, basically, through the wars, some sort of natural boundaries were formed around countries, institutions formed based upon some natural internal process that basically built capable, strong states. And fragile states are almost always post-colonial. There are some exceptions. Ethiopia would be an exception because it was never really colonized, but it's much larger today than it was historically. And because the boundaries are artificial, you basically have state structures that were put in place that are divorced from the social dynamics, and in many cases have not deeply penetrated society. Doesn't have those elements I mentioned. They're not autonomous. They're not effective. They're not legitimate across groups, and so on and so forth. And you have that to a great extent in all the developed countries because of their different histories.
So I have a quick follow-up. You talked about the warmth, sort of you grew up here and you felt that maybe the relationships that you had experienced growing up weren't everything you were looking for. I did not grow up here. And I was wondering if you can just go a little deeper almost at a personal level into what warm meant to you, because we would, there's three of us on this podcast and two are from Eastern Europe, where you could sort of say as a blanket statement that relationships are warmer. And one of us that stereotypically in the Northern Europe, we think, at least those of us from the East and the South, think of the Northerners as a bit cooler, a bit more distant, a bit more formal. But it's so interesting.
Why do you think I left?
But, all three of us actually ended up here in the US. And I can definitely see at a personal level where there is that stereotypical view of the US where, you're 18, you get out of the house, you're on your own, versus the warmer sort of more family involvement, more community involvement throughout your whole life that we would experience. And I'm speaking in broad lines, stereotypically. And it's really funny you mentioned that about growing up, because one of the, I don't know if you're familiar with this comedy from the 90s, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where that warmth became subject of comedy. And it's one of my favorite movies, and I usually use it to describe what's the culture like that I grew up in. But just talk a little bit about the warmth, because that level of closeness sometimes is necessary for survival if you're thinking historically within communities around the world. But it also has its downsides, let's say. Sometimes it does restrict your personal development, your personal growth, and even community growth when norms, I'm thinking here, James Robinson's book, The Narrow Corridor, when norms actually hold back state development. So can you walk us through the warmth part and how you think of that balance?
So for sure. I mean, clearly any society and any individual, there's a balance, or there's these extremes. You're completely conformist in a very tightly knit social structure, and then it's impossible to be completely, but you're highly autonomous. And each of us are looking for that. There's like a spectrum, and we're looking for that spot that we're comfortable with. And I think for society as a whole, I mean, you could argue the United States, people felt the 50s were too tight, so the 60s were rebellion. And part of my argument is we've swung too far towards autonomy, and that to be healthy, every human being to be healthy, to thrive, needs relationships and needs meaning. I think this is foundational, and it's written into the makeup of humans. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that. And so when we move so far away, I think there naturally has to be a swing back. And so part of the mission for my book is to help that swing back so we find a better equilibrium in our society. But personally, we often are reactions to our to what we grew up. We grew up one way, and then we react to that. And we're all looking for different things, and we all have different needs, and we don't always land exactly where we want, but we're always searching. So I grew up, and I can just speak some personal, few personal things. I mean, I felt bullied to some extent in school. I was a little bit the different child, the one who asked the questions or whatever it was, the one who wasn't so cool. So I had some negative experiences. I happened to grow up having trouble speaking. It seems very hard now, but I spoke very late, and then I stuttered till I got to college. So if you combined whatever my personality, whatever it is, I felt this great need for close relationships. That plus my parents divorced when I was 13. So you can combine all these things, is that they sensitize me in a way that I think most other people are not sensitized to how relationships affect us. And it sort of gives me this perspective about, and I project it onto community, I project it onto neighborhood, I project it onto society. It gives me a lens to think about how those things function and how I personally experience them. And then think of some of the choices I made. I felt that need, so quote unquote escaped from college as soon as I could. I got 2.5 years, and then I was out of college, finished my credits in a different city. And before my class had graduated, I was in the Middle East, and then I was in Africa. And I loved Africa, very warm. Middle East, very warm. Latin America, I didn't spend so much time. So it wasn't a great design, but I was searching for that. Later in life, I'll also say I became religious. I didn't grow up in a very religious home, but I became more religious because also, if you live in America, one of the few places, and it's not always, the story I mentioned before was a very atheist academic who found a very warm community in Connecticut. I, on the other hand, wanted to find warmth, so I found it in a more religious setting. And then I get to balance because I have my neighborhood, I have my community, and yet here I am doing whatever I want professionally, so I don't feel constrained. There are some constraints, but I don't feel it constrains me in anything that's important to me. So I would just say personally, I mean, because of the way I grew up, because of what bothered me or I was sensitive to, and then I started building this database, and what I was interested in was warm communities, warm neighborhoods. I've been drawn to this. You might have experienced the opposite and you wanted to get away from it. But for me, I mean, I came back to America. This is where I was from. This is where I have family. But I also found some sort of medium in which I would be here, but I would have my community and my warm relationships and my neighborhood. Long before I ever thought about this book, I found a neighborhood that wasn't just, it had religion in it, but it was special because it was much warmer than the other neighborhoods with some religion in it that I ever experienced. And so my neighborhood is very special. And I even spent 750 words in my last chapter of my book explaining why this neighborhood is different than almost every other neighborhood you can find in America. And that's why I live here. So I think for me personally, my ability to thrive as a person requires these types of relationships in my life. So it's a personal journey, but I'm certainly also reading on what I see and the data and the stories I'm hearing. And there's a lot of reasons why I landed on this topic.
This really resonates with me, and actually it makes me kind of rethink why I did the things I did after high school and college, because I also sought out, unwittingly at this point even still, the Middle East, this interesting, maybe more warm, maybe more complex, kind of community that I felt that we didn't have in Sweden. And it's interesting what you note, Mahela, about the norms that kind of promote the community over the individual and the state. I feel in Sweden we almost have the opposite, where the norms promote the individual and the state on at the expense of the community, and to
United
the point
States is
where
the same. United States is worse. I'm sure the United States is worse in that respect.
Yeah, I'm sure it is, but it's interesting in Sweden in one way because we've outsourced a lot of the things that communities do to the state in terms of our socialized healthcare, and not just socialized healthcare, but just all the care that communities normally do sits with the state, and this becomes very apparent when there is a crisis or something where people are like, but like, why should I contribute? Why should I, put money or do something? Because the state is there and I pay my taxes, so they're taking care of it. But I wanted to build a bit on the this idea of searching, traveling, moving around to different cultures, and think quickly about migration. As a topic, the mixing of these, as you mentioned, kind of cold and warm cultures, because I feel in the discourse today it's talked a lot about as something that make countries and neighborhoods more fragile, that breaks up social cohesion in certain ways, and I'm sure that is a lot about how the states handle it, and I think you mentioned in your book as well, where you kind of create special neighborhoods and everything that makes it that creates these rifts within society. But from your point of view, with the theories that you lay out in the book and based on your work, how should we be thinking about fragility on the neighborhood level or on the state city level and migration? Is there something we can say that makes sense and that can kind of shift the narrative a bit on this?
I mean, it's a very complex country, and as you know, every country is different. I mean, different countries have different absorptive capacities. I mean, the United States has a great absorptive capacity. On the other hand, if migration levels get so high, I think almost everywhere you have a backlash. And the question is, what's the level in terms of absorbing into your culture, into your society, and that the population, I mean, we live in democratic countries, are willing to accept. So migration clearly can add a lot of dynamism, can add warmth in fragile neighborhoods and fragile cities, areas, places. Migration can be enormously helpful because there's a lot of outward movement, and to the extent that you can attract people from elsewhere to move into those places. I mean, you can find parts of the United States in which there are areas that were severely depleted in terms of population, and now see a boost in population because of immigration. I mean, housing is cheap. Those places tend to be smallish, so things are close to each other. It may be a big city, but there's a neighborhood or there's a town. And so a community can move in, or a series of waves of migrants can move in, and they're near each other. They have their community, they have their stores, their restaurants, and they're close to each other, and the whole area benefits. And so clearly there's examples of that. On the other hand, it's always the idea of social cohesion and migration. I mean, the thing is, it's good. This is where I would say the material and the social, we have to think of these with sort of different lenses. They both are important. Clearly, from the material perspective, migration is a big plus to receiving countries. It's a big plus to the migrants. That's clear. I think from the social perspective, it always has to be managed wisely in terms of distribution of people, in terms of how do you absorb them in the society so the whole society remains welcoming. You can be welcoming today, and then in 5 years you're not as welcoming because you didn't absorb them and integrate them well. So it's not a question. We always have to think, I think, manage social cohesion. We're talking well beyond the scope of what I've wrote in this book, but in terms of my work in fragile states, social cohesion is not something to be ignored. It's something that needs to be proactively promoted, managed, and to the extent that it needs to be invested in, to the extent that we don't invest in social cohesion, I think it will naturally, even if just gradually, decline, and eventually there will be repercussions. States need strong cohesion so that people will come together at times of need. They will cooperate. They will include all aspects of society. People won't be marginalized. The less able we are to do that, the more risks we are putting into our societies that we do not want to have.
So just now you mentioned the words wise management, which will give me now the possibility to tune down the warmth a bit and shift to a more analytical sort of perspective.
Let me get a sweater.
So tell us a bit about, in the book, so let's tell us a bit about your diagnostic about what is not working in fragile neighborhoods today. What are the features? Well, you mentioned drug abuse and other things, and loneliness and social decay, and link that a bit to some of your core concepts in the book. You talked about, social poverty versus economic poverty. You also discuss collective efficacy. So help us a bit navigate this storyline that sort of sets up then your recommendations of what do you think should happen to address these problems, and who are the ones best able to address them?
Okay. Well, first think that I'm very practical. There's lots of books lamenting what's wrong with our societies. Some of them are talking about problems with our democracy. Some of them are problems with our politics, problems with our policies. We need this policy. We need that policy. We all live in or near Washington. There's loads of think tanks. They spend a lot of time thinking of ideas or debating ideas. And so when I thought about this topic, I think a few principles guided the way I wanted to go about investigating and then exploring and then writing this book. One guiding principle was, which I think Johan pointed out, is that there's a limit to what the state can do in terms of bolstering our relationships. So yes, policy matters, but there's an awful lot of people thinking about policy, and yet our relationships and our social institutions have decayed for decades. I wanted to look at what social entrepreneurs, what was happening with social institutions, what were people doing on the ground. This is very parallel to what I do whenever I'm in a fragile state. Yes, the policies matter, but my general inclination is let's always start with the people. Let's always start with what the people are thinking, what the people are doing, what initiatives are happening, what types of institutions are working, not working, and only gradually work, say, from the bottom up. That's how I like to understand things. And I look very much horizontal. It's built into my thinking that society is not vertical, society is horizontal. And what is happening varies place to place. And only the combination of all those things we actually see reflected at the national level. So I basically, one principle about my book was that I'm going to start with social institutions, and I'm going to start with people who are actually doing things on the ground. Those are two things. So the middle of my book, I lay out the problem, and I don't think me laying out the problem is terribly different than what you could find elsewhere, with one big exception. And this is another principle. A lot of people, when they talk about distressed neighborhoods or problematic problems with neighborhoods, they're mostly talking about poor people. There are roughly 825 distressed neighborhoods. Distressed neighborhoods is 30% or above poverty in a specific neighborhood. So you can go to parts of Washington, parts of Baltimore, parts of New York, any major city, and in some places like Detroit or Cleveland or Buffalo, a lot more than many parts of the city, you have distressed neighborhoods. So when most people think of the problem of neighborhoods, they're thinking about that. But one of the principles is the problem of neighborhoods, the problem of relationships is not only the problem of poverty. So I have a whole chapter in my book about the problem of neighborhoods in materially well-off places. I think the problems are different, but there still goes back to the issue of relationships. If we don't know anybody, if we're outsourcing, we outsource jobs to overseas factories, we basically outsourced our love and our care for those close to us to other people. We hire people, we use apps. If there's a problem in my child's school, we don't go anymore. We pay somebody to go and solve the problem. And we don't need to meet our neighbors. We don't need to go to a local market. We're going to order everything in. So there's loads of things going on. But going back to and that's affecting our neighborhood's resilience. It's affecting our own personal well-being, I believe, in many, many ways. Subtle ways that each one step doesn't matter. But if you accumulate all those steps, we tend to be isolated. We tend to be not so trustful of other people. We're not in close relationships. So again, one principle was I want to focus on institutions. One principle was that I want to focus on people who are actually doing things. One focus was I wanted to focus on rich and poor neighborhoods. And what I do is I looked at five organizations, all focused on different things, 4 institutions and one focused on the physical makeup of a place, because the physical makeup of a place affects the institutions, just like Egypt with its one river affects the nature of institutions in Egypt. They're not going to be the institutions you have in Afghanistan with its mountains and population all over the country. The shape of a place affects the institutions. So that was one chapter on an organization working on that. And then I brought it all together. So for me, I've aimed from the beginning to be this horizontal or more bottom up, to focus on the practical, to not focus on what the state can do. Yes, every chapter, those 5 chapters, as well as my 10 takeaways in chapter 9, they all are practical things. Some of them involve policy, but I do not want to start from policy. I want to start from what people are doing. What are the problems with schools in place, problem with community in place, problems with family in place, problem with family structures in place, and the problem with the physical layout of that people are experiencing. And I want to draw conclusions and then cross-cutting conclusions. I try to be as practical as I possibly can be with that layout of the book.
So just to zero in on that a bit, so for our listeners or viewers who may not be so familiar with the problems of American neighborhoods, they may see things on the news related to gun violence and all of that. Can you just list 4 or 5 problems that would help people imagine how it's like, that kind of an experience?
Yes, thank you. Well, the way I would look at it is we tend to focus on problems, and I'm focused on social context. And so think about problems. You have, all the problems. You have drug problems. Over 100,000 Americans die every year from drug overdose. That is double the number of people that died in Vietnam. And Vietnam was over many years. Remember the protests from Vietnam, 60s and 70s? I don't see many protests over the drug deaths. It's kind of amazing how many people die and how little attention it receives in the national conversation. But so you have the problems of deaths of despair. You have the problems of suicides. You may not see it; it's happening. You have the problems of I would say teenagers and young people being much more depressed and unhappy especially since around 2011, 2012. So these are things that you're seeing. But my argument is, and of course you have all the material problems. You have hunger. You have residential instability. You have the problem of family stability, which doesn't get much of a conversation in the United States. But roughly speaking, the United States is much, much different than Europe in terms of family stability. We both have become much more liberal on marriage and divorce and not getting married or getting divorced and so on and so forth. But the statistics are quite stark in terms of children's experience growing up in stable families, stable houses, stable neighborhoods. You very rarely in Europe see the extent that we have millions and millions and millions of children that are not experiencing the type of upbringing and social context at home, on their street, in their neighborhood that will allow them to thrive. And that's a major driver of inequality in the United States. So these are all things that I would say you're looking at that you would not necessarily see elsewhere. But I think the key point I want to make is, for me, the outcomes, whether it's deaths of despair, suicides, children that aren't happy, those are downstream. And what I've tried to focus on is that if you looked around the United States, the title of my book includes the zip code. You have zip codes or neighborhoods that are doing very well. My neighborhood, I chose this neighborhood on purpose. You have the academic I mentioned with the neighborhood that she discovered by action in Connecticut. You have parts of the United States in which there are high degrees of social cohesion, social support. You have Chevy Chase, which is very wealthy, but also a socially thriving neighborhood near Washington. And you have some poor areas that I can tell you they're immigrant communities, or they're very closely tied in terms of people, and they're socially thriving. They don't necessarily have all these problems. But if we want to tackle these issues that I've raised, I believe we need to go to the neighborhoods. We need to go to the institutions that are in those neighborhoods, and we need to find ways to strengthen those dynamics. And we can get into solutions or things you can do, but I don't believe tackling suicides by tackling suicides, tackling loneliness by tackling loneliness, that is not the answer to these problems, in my opinion. Yes, you need to do things, but we'd be much better off with dealing with the cross-cutting social context that is increasing those problems across the board.
So just picking up quickly on that, and I understand that this is wearing the outsiders goggles, the European goggles, coming to the US. One of these downstream issues that you mentioned that is so pervasive is homelessness, and so I'm wondering how should we think about homelessness in the context of fragile neighborhoods? Because on the one hand, it's, as you say, a downstream effect of this social fragility. But on the other hand, I can also see it being a kind of a driver or a secondary driver that keeps a neighborhood fragile because it doesn't create the conditions for it to kind of move out of this fragile context. So I'm just curious about your thoughts. It's an idea that came to mind, and I understand you don't tackle it specifically in the book, but would love to hear your thoughts on it.
I think there's two ways to look at this. Clearly, there's specific policies that governments can adopt to deal with the specific issue. I don't want to talk about that. I think a lot of other people have thought well about that. What interests me is why we have residential instability, why we have people who don't have places to go to sleep. And I'll give you the example of Eastern Kentucky. One of my chapters is on an organization that works in Eastern Kentucky. I traveled, I looked for organizations, and when I went there, again, they're working with schools. It's an organization that works with the school districts across the region of, this is Central Appalachia, and some of the statistics you would hear there are shocking. So, for example, there is a county in that area in which 25% of the students, 1 out of every 4 students, does not know where they're sleeping night to night, because people have died, people are out of their homes, because of family breakdown, because people are in jail. You could think of all sorts of reasons. This is the center of the opioids crisis, or right now it's the fentanyl crisis. But you also have an area in which there's gross outward migration, because there's school districts in which the number of students is half of what it was before. You have very little opportunity. You have a lot of poverty. And so the whole social fabric is very torn. And I think I mean, when I look at problems like that, I think of a few things. First, if a person's homeless, that likely means they're not part of, I mean, they could have mental illness, they could have other problems, but the first question that always comes to mind is, do they have a strong family network? Somebody in their family network. I mean, I happen to have my wife's family my wife comes from Eastern Europe as well. Her family isn't doing very well. She has a mother and she has a brother. And if we were not helping them financially, helping them in terms of daily, I mean, she's doing the work. I'm just taking the credit, so forgive me. But if you're not daily on the phone with them, trying to figure out their problems, trying to help them, and they're not always well, they go to the hospital for whatever reasons. If it wasn't for her and the work she does, one or both of those would be homeless people. So clearly one question that comes to mind is, what is the family network? It can be all types of family, but what is the family behind that? And that's also a thing of relationships. The second thing I would be asking is, what is the neighborhood that would be asking that question? In my neighborhood, I mean, we have lots of neighborhood-based institutions to help people who are in need. If you have things you don't need, you give it to some sort of loan society. The society's not loaning money, it's loaning clothes, it's loaning toys, it's things like that. We have people in our neighborhood who could not take care of themselves, but are being helped partly by their family, but also partly by other institutions in our neighborhood. We wonder what will happen to them if their family, those people are probably in their 30s. What happens if their family's not there? But the whole key is there's a web, and thriving neighborhoods have a web of overlapping institutions. The way the United States and other developed countries have evolved, we used to live in places with lots of overlapping institutions, and that made sure however those institutions, there was limits to those institutions. They constrained us, they discriminated in many ways, but they were there, and they tended not to let anybody fall through the cracks if there was a need or an emergency. When you live in a society like we live in today, which is a network society, and you belong to lots of institutions, or networks, they're not overlapping. Lots of people are not a member of those that you need to succeed. They may not have supportive family. They may not have any institutions in their neighborhood that are actually looking at them. Mostly we have a vacuum of social institutions where there used to be a thick set of institutions that overlapped. And therefore, there are a lot of people who just get lost. And they may not be homeless. They could be alone. They could be falling into problems with drugs. A lot of things are going on. And not that overlapping set of institutions can solve all problems, but when they're not there, you have a lot of people who are falling through the cracks, and that to me is the problem of neighborhood. There's no other way. We all live in a neighborhood. Each of you, whether you think about it or not, you live in a neighborhood. There's no exception to rich or poor. We all live in a place. We could all build up institutions in various ways, but if they're not place-based, and every place doesn't have some set of institutions that people are engaged with, embedded in, that they're meeting people with, and that each of them are taking some sort of responsibility for each other, there's simply no way we can reach all those people that are falling through the cracks. And there happens to be quite a lot of them in a country like the United States, which is highly focused on autonomy, individualism, and to a certain extent, not supporting social institutions in any way.
So the simplest question I have is why? Why did this happen? How did we get here? And if you're thinking back of the culture with all of its faults, the culture of previous decades in this country, right, where you did have some of those overlapping institutions, again, with all of their weaknesses and faults and downsides, how did we get to a culture where, and through culture, I mean, this is how we do things around here. How did we get to a culture where we can allow some of these symptoms like homelessness, whether it's caused by economic situation or emotional issues. How do we think about those roots, the drivers, and to think both at the federal level, at the state, at the community level? What did we lose that got us to where we are today?
Well, first, let's think how these issues connect to some broader questions. Why did Brexit take place? Why do you have Frenchmen on the streets protesting in Paris? Why is there so much dissatisfaction in the United States, in parts of Europe, with governments, with leaders, with elites? For me, all of this is driven to some extent by what has been lost in terms of the nature of our societies. They've left a lot of people behind. Those people feel underappreciated, undercared for. It's partly in the policies, the politics, the rhetoric of the people who run the countries. But I also think it's very much connected to the what they're seeing in their lives and the sense of loss, the sense of disconnection, and other things like that leave those people very alienated. And so let's think, there's a lot of products we're not even touching upon in our discussion. It's not just the problem of the material things that we see locally. I think it affects the politics of countries. And in terms of how this happened, a lot of it's simply the product. I mean, the product of what has changed in our society since the 60s. Not all of it had to be that way. I think there's a lot of things we could have done differently. But first, you do have a reaction in the 60s and afterwards to the fact that the society was too stultifying, too conformist, and I think that's a natural reaction. A lot of people felt discriminated against. Civil rights movement in the United States, and then other rights movement, whether it's women, whether it's gays, other movements. I think all of that is highly legitimate. People that are being constrained certainly have a right to seek out more freedom, more opportunity, and to be unhappy with the status quo. However, I also think what we've created in the United States, again, more than you have in Europe, and that's why these problems are worse. We've built a society that's based upon taking the best students, the most capable people, and we've basically told them all, leave wherever you are, leave your neighborhood, leave your city, leave your community, and go work in a few cities. Go work in some multinational companies, multilateral institutions, work in government, whatever it is. So we've had an enormous brain drain. Just think of the brain drain out of all the neighborhoods. So where you used to have a relatively equal distribution, it was never equal, of course, but a rarely equal distribution of institutions and talent, even if some of those neighborhoods were discriminated against. Think about black neighborhoods versus white neighborhoods and other Native American places versus white places. There was discrimination, but because of the way we've become such a meritocracy, we've drawn a lot of talent to a few places and we've left a lot of places behind. And that's one thing. Second thing, think about how we've thought about designing our places, our space. The United States is a country that seems to be built for roads. Everything is designed to get from point A to point B. There's very little thought whether A or B is flourishing. The key point is you need to have your nice house, your nice grass lawn. Let's not talk about the environment with that. Your nice green lawn, your house, your car, and you need to be able to go from point A to point B. And that seems to be how we've designed the country. We didn't have to design the country this way. Whether it's because of the way policies have been adopted, whether it's the way developers take their relationship to government, whether it's because of our idea of freedom, our idea of the American dream, all those things have led to certainly a development pattern that seems almost designed to isolate ourselves from each other. You go to the suburbs, I'm up here in Maryland, You go to the suburbs, not so far from me, and you see house after house after house. There's no center to a neighborhood. There's no community school. We used to have community schools. We used to have churches, community schools. We used to have local shopping. We used to have some sort of institutions. Could be civic. It also could just be networks of families, what have you. Lots of things brought people together. Some of them were just spontaneous. In my neighborhood, it's possible. I see what's possible. I go to the supermarket, which is 10 minutes walk from me, and I will bump into 3 neighbors. And I can't get in. I mean, sometimes I want to get in and out fast, but there's also a joy in knowing that I'm going to meet someone and I don't know who I'm going to meet. And there's a couple of restaurants and there's one drugstore. It's not beautiful, but it's a center. There's a couple of parks. Probably about 3/4 of the kids in my daughter's or my children's schools come from walking distance from where I am now. So think about what those, but for many Americans, they don't have that. They shop, even before the COVID, they shop, they go by car to shop. Their kids are in a school that's not so close to where they live. There's no way for them locally to meet lots of people. Maybe if you live in a cul-de-sac, you'll meet your neighbors, but if you live on a street with lots of traffic, you won't. I mean, we've designed our country in many ways. Yes, some of it is technology, some of it is reaction to the way life was before, but I think a lot of it is the choices we have made of a society to go for the material, and the end result is that we've designed a society that isolates us from one another on many, many levels.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, I'm hearing a lot of law of unintended consequences. We did things without thinking what will happen. But usually
it goes back, if I may interject, we have to think about the material well-being and the social well-being of people. That's extremely important. In a fragile state, I'm thinking more of the macro social dynamics. That's my entry point. In a more developed society, the GDP growth figure is what we pay attention on. What's the social dynamic statistic? You can't create it, but clearly American lifespans are going down. Something is seriously wrong. We're not thinking very hard about the choices we make and how they impact people and what it means for their well-being. And that, to me, it's all relational and it has lots of, as you say, that's unintended consequences, but it has great implications for people and their well-being.
So, it's interesting to what you've said, because if you think of the archetypal hero's journey, it's usually the hero who departs on some great adventure, accumulates experience, knowledge, goes through all sorts of trials, and then returns home to contribute to the place, to bring all of that knowledge in a way and sort of rejuvenate and renew the place from where the hero is left. It's the story of myths and a lot of meaning that gets provided through that. You mentioned, though, meritocracy, and I remember when I came to the US, meritocracy was one of the things that was most attractive about this country, and the fact that it was your sort of social mobility and your how far you could go was really not dictated by your family of origin. I mean, to some extent, of course, there's always exceptions. But do you think we need to... How should we rethink meritocracy then, in a way to preserve what's best about it? That level of impersonal, sort of merit-driven achievement and that benefits all society, and yet try to maybe change people's trajectory on this hero's journey. And I'm speaking here almost like, an immigrant, because I've also left and I've not decided to go to go back, even though I go fairly often.
So let me say a few things. So clearly meritocracy is a great benefit to our societies, the United States and other countries that are very meritocratic. To the extent that we can actually be meritocratic. We're never perfect. to the extent that we are able to achieve it better than other countries, it's a great asset. And the fact that we're able to attract immigrants such as each of you to come to this country because there's freedoms, because there's opportunities that you might not have had at home. This is all great. This is great news for the United States, and there's a lot of great things happening in the United States. I mean, in terms of material, generating innovation, generating advances in the material well-being, this country is pretty good. For the population size, it's easily the best country in achieving those things. There might be smaller countries that could do a little better, but in terms of the scale, it's unbeatable. I think that we don't need to change the model. We just need to think differently about how we're approaching lots of problems. And it could be there's some initiatives. I'll give you an example of an initiative that I really like. There's an organization called Lead for America. I know several people there. Lead for America. It started several years ago to address the specific problem of basically brain drain from large parts of the country. And there's very good data on brain drain coming into only a few places. And they basically look at college students and they offer them pathways that they would not have had previously, and they make them heroes. You know, the thing is, you want to elevate an idea that there's a different path, that you can go back to your town, you can go back to your state, you can go back to your smaller city. That could be your pathway, and you can not only go back and do something, you also have a great opportunity to contribute. I mean, I know, for example, one of the leaders lives in a town in southern Minnesota. Very talented person, went to some very top school. She goes back, I don't know her age, but let's say she's 27, whatever years old, around that age. And here she is, a chance to play a leadership role in her town. And if she was in Washington, she would be a very junior person in any major organization. And there, she has family ties. She can take initiatives, try to start things that no one else is doing. It's wide open, and their initiative has done nothing to deter the meritocracy from occurring, but they've taken some of the talent and tried to refunnel it. Let me give you another example. There's a woman I know who lives in the South Bronx, Majora Carter, wrote a great book last year, and she's trying to revitalize her neighborhood. What happens? There's a lot of she calls it I hate to use the term given our audience, but she uses the term poverty industrial complex. The poverty industrial complex, all they want to do for her neighborhood is build healthcare centers, things that are for poor people. They want to put low-income housing. They want to put health clinics for sick people. They don't want to do anything but that. But her vision is very different. She wants to make the neighborhood attractive, because the only way for poor neighborhoods to not be poor is they have to become middle-income neighborhoods. I mean, you want to do that in a way that's positive so the people in it are benefiting and not being pushed out. But basically, you can't undo poverty unless a place becomes middle-income. But to do that, it's not going to help by just putting another low-income housing in there. It's not going to help by putting just more health clinics. And it's not going to help if our society has a mindset that all the best people ought to get up and leave, which is what we often have. You've made it, you've left your place. And then you basically create a country of two classes. There might be something in the middle, but a class of people who've made it and people who've been left behind. That's what the meritocracy has done. So I think we need to think about not individuals thriving, we need to make places thrive. So there's a lot of policies that we can do to encourage places to be more attractive for people to move into. There's a lot of things, purpose-built community, which is one of the chapters of my book. One of their main instruments to take a very distressed neighborhood and make it a thriving neighborhood is they build housing to equal to about 10% of the housing in the neighborhood. They want to build 10% new housing geared towards middle-income families. And they do that, and they work with the school, make the school thriving, and they put in community amenities So people want to live there, whether it's supermarkets or gyms or whatever it is. And they have a package of things they do. And once they start the neighborhood on a virtuous cycle, lots of other investment comes in. Economic investment, but also social investment, because people move there and they build up institutions and they themselves invest in relationships. And you need to do both. And so the answer to your question is, if we focused on how do we distribute talent and opportunity spatially across neighborhoods and cities, across different regions in the country, that will be one thing. And if we design programs that would ensure that we focus more on place-based well-being, thriving, flourishing neighborhoods, could be counties if you're rural, could be towns, but we don't want to measure national GDP. We want to measure our national well-being. We want to measure each place, and there's a lot of places in America. This is a big country. We want to know how many of those places are doing well, how many are being left behind, and what do we need to do to get those being left behind to do better in the future. That is what we should be trying to accomplish. And that will draw people into it and make that will be like a cycle. That will also make the talent pool wider distributed, and it would mean investments, economic and social, in lots of places that desperately need it.
So what you're describing here, this concept is akin to one that you also mentioned in your book, which is placemaking. So this idea of creating these thriving communities, capitalizing on what's there, and then bringing in these other aspects. But another thought that came to me when we discussed, you mentioned dynamic companies, Paul brought up meritocracy, you mentioned now we have to help communities and neighborhoods become middle income, is the role of private sector and jobs. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to perhaps this placemaking concept, but also within that, what is the role of the private sector and jobs in making societies less fragile, because also within the context of a national or perhaps global trend that's saying that we need to bring back the jobs from overseas. Jobs have been lost. It could be really interesting to hear if there's any relationship as well between that trend and the ability to use the private sector to make cohesion greater in these neighborhoods.
So clearly, economic and social, I think of them separately. There is for sure there's some relationship between the two. Those that are doing materially better are more likely to, it's not always the case. That's why you can be materially poor and socially rich and vice versa. But those that are poor, if they're able to advance, I think at least there'll be some progress on the social side. So, but I would look at the role of the private sector when we talk about the private sector, we often mean what incentives can we create for companies to invest? And we tend to just stop there. And the way I would think about it somewhat differently. And you can all talk about bringing factories back, and there could be benefits for that, but that's not really where I've spent a lot of time thinking. What I would be thinking about in terms of wealth creation, I would be thinking about how do we create indigenous wealth to the neighborhoods that need it. And I'll just name a few things that can do that. There's a program started in Germantown outside of Philadelphia where somebody goes in and instead of typically what happens is a lot of poor people, if the neighborhood's going to get better or people think it might get better, they sell out. They don't know how to invest in their home, how to deal with banks. People don't have a lot of knowledge. So this organization goes in to a place that has an opportunity to gentrify or be better, but it was originally poor, went in and worked with residents, taught them skills on getting loans, taught them skills about how to refurbishing, renovating properties, taught them to skills about how to buy and sell and things like that, and then provided access to capital. And so what they did was they helped people in a place create wealth in a way that they could not before. That's a very simple example. I mean, anything that would help indigenous wealth creation, help people build wealth, help small companies, could be opening retail, whatever it might be. I'm a big believer that we try to build wealth broadly. We don't just focus on big companies. So that would be certainly one way. A completely different way of thinking about it is often neighborhoods, their ability to thrive is about how well connected they are to where other opportunity is. And we're talking now more about poor neighborhoods, not the middle income neighborhoods or whatever, the problems of the social or the fragile neighborhoods of materially well-off people. That is not a problem of money. That's a problem of institutions and the way neighborhoods are shaped, and that's a different set of problems. But if you're talking about a poor neighborhood, I have somebody I've been working with who's in Dallas. Dallas, it happens to be, I think about 45% of the population lives in the southern part of the city, relatively poor. There's many reasons why that place is poor. But I mean, one reason is there's a lack of institutions, whether it's government or banks or other private sector that actually even exists in the places where the poor people are so that they have access. So certainly on one avenue, you can be helping people build up small companies. And that's something this guy actually started a farm, help people in that neighborhood, started a farm. This is in parts of Dallas, hired lots of people, helped train some of them to do spin-offs so they could start their own businesses. So that was building opportunity and wealth creation. But then he also started helping bring in institutions, because people that didn't have access to institutions the way you and I do, and now he's trying to create some sort of credit union so people have access to credit for whether it's for their housing or for their small business. But I would go one step further. There's also the transportation. People depend upon buses. People want to get cars. You know, if you come out of jail, how hard it is to get a car, to get a loan for a car. So, if you get a loan, you get very high interest rates. So there's obstacles to people in specific places. They're not necessarily, some of them are place-based, some of them are based upon the nature of the people in that place, but it creates a cascade effect if lots of people in the neighborhood don't have access to institutions, don't have access to jobs, don't have access to transportation to get to jobs. And so you got to think about all these issues if you want to. So private sector has a role. But I would be trying to build up the wealth. But also I would be thinking is, how does the private sector serve and support the uplifting of those people and solve some of the obstacles facing people in those places?
So you just mentioned the word serve, and building on Johan's question, the follow-up I had is then, in your model, then what is the role for public service and for the politicians elected to, represent? We have a House of Representatives, and they're supposed to represent the local communities that you mentioned. So obviously your argument is that the protagonists of your book are in many ways clergy, business leaders, volunteers, school boards who sort of make their communities flourish. But when their problems are, let's say, symptoms of national issues, then what is the role of representatives of politicians ultimately who are supposed to go from there to DC, and has something been lost in that sort of art of maybe carrying here the local specificity of where they come from?
Well, I would say a few things. First, the governments that could be most effective at addressing these issues are not the governments that are far away. It's the governments that are close. One of the conclusions I draw, I have 10 takeaways in my second to last chapter. The last chapter is on what you could do. Each of us have a role to play to making your life or our lives more socially rich. And I have some principles how we all can have a more socially rich, or contribute to our neighborhood, or contribute to our society. But in that 9th chapter, I have 10 what I call operational lessons. One of those lessons is for government to be more effective, government needs to be closer to the specific places. If you live in a big urban area, your government could be quite distant. There could be millions of people, and there's no level of government between the center of the city and the parts of the city. There's no neighborhood government, so to speak. And there's also, actually, government isn't evaluated on place indicators. So one of my arguments is that government should not be organized around silos. It should be organized around teams, place-based teams, with the functional areas serving those teams, and those teams spending long periods of time, many, many years, working on neighborhoods and being evaluated not on the permits that they've issued or the housing units they've built, but on how much their neighborhood thrives. And we can come up with data, some of it material, a lot of it social. What does it mean to thrive socially, materially? And I think the more that those types of teams are empowered, the more useful government will be. You have some of that at the town level, where the town unit is for basically a neighborhood, a large neighborhood or a series of neighborhoods. You don't have that at the city level. Federal money, a lot of federal money is very rigidly distributed. It doesn't allow local creativity. It's all quantitatively organized. So you have funding streams that are very oriented upward, and I think government should be oriented downward. We want downward accountability. We don't want upward orientation. In fact, even a lot of nonprofits, because nonprofits look to government money, whereas nonprofits used to be dependent upon local funding and local volunteers. Nonprofits today, they have offices in Washington, they advocate, they get money in checks, they're national. If they don't go around working with people, they go around serving people. And therefore, they're not dependent upon neighborhoods. They don't have to care so much what people think. And they're all doing good work, but they're not oriented towards making places thrive the way the nonprofit world used to be. And so part of that is the way government is organized. Part of that is the way philanthropy is organized. For me, all those things should be turned upside down so that government, nonprofits, everybody thought about what do we need to help neighborhoods, places where people live, thrive. And if we were measuring success based upon that, a lot of things would change.
So as I'm listening to you, I suddenly had sort of a light bulb moment. It seems to me that the weakness of neighborhoods, the weakness of community-based institutions has led to an unintended consequence where responsibilities and expectations have been flowing upwards at the macro level, at the state level, at sort of national types of organizations. And now we're in the state where they have become obstacles to change in the right direction. And I just want to set up my question in the following way. You've mentioned the lady from South Bronx talking about the poverty industrial complex. And I actually think it's quite an accurate term. Also, we're thinking private sector and transportation policies. And all of a sudden, we are in a new ecosystem of entities that, not through any, let's say, evil intent, are seeking, just like any organism in any ecosystem, their own survival and continuation in perpetuity. So they have now, whether it's macro level policies like our national transportation policy, whether it's those non-for-profits that have a mission, and each year they have to worry about the budget and the fundraising, and the only way they're going to keep existing is if their mission stays relevant. And we measure GDP because it's much easier than social well-being. And we also have the private sector, which sometimes it can be a friend and sometimes it can be a foe. Because if we're thinking about you mentioned the example of, do you know how hard it is to get a car after you get out of jail? And I said, okay, you can get the car, you can get the loan, but what if you can't hold down the job and you can't pay your insurance? Then in most states, you'll get your license suspended and you can't drive anyway. So it's actually quite expensive to be poor in this country. It's shocking.
Yes, it's shocking.
So how do we think, ultimately we're trying to revitalize certain institutions that can help life be better in the places where we live, closest to us. However, we now have, because of the weakness of these places, we have these other new obstacles that are quite powerful. How do we go about addressing these obstacles? And again, my question is not very focused, but it's something that, you mentioned the clergy, the businesses, the community organizers in your book, and they are addressing part of this problem, but how should we think about it, even in those communities where it's not fragile, that some of the things we put in place to govern us at the national level are now obstacles to well-being?
Okay, a few points. I mean, we spoke in our previous conversation about the role of leadership. Clearly, this is an opportunity for people, for leaders to step up, for organizations to step up. I mean, I wrote a book on fragile neighborhoods. I wrote this book with this idea is that we want to change the way people think about our problems, think differently about what are solutions to those problems. And my audience is everybody from a nonprofit to a philanthropist, to a politician, to a policymaker, anybody who's in a position to step up and say, this is how we need to think differently. And these are very practical things that we can do. They don't have to be in my book, but if you become aware of what we're talking about here, I think there's a lot of different things that can be done. But let's give some examples of leadership. So there's a new mayor in Atlanta, probably not so new anymore. He's been there for, I think he started office beginning of last year. And it happens to be that, again, I have a chapter in my book about an organization called Purpose-Built Community, which happens to be based in Atlanta, and the first distressed neighborhood they worked to revitalize was in Atlanta. So the fact that a mayor of Atlanta comes to office with a strong emphasis on neighborhoods possibly should not surprise us. But there you have a mayor who makes it a priority, puts in his transition plan, brings in people to help him think about it, and is taking, I couldn't speak of the details because I'm not following it, but at least there's the desire to make neighborhoods that are fragile more resilient, more thriving, and is working on a series of partnerships with civil society, nonprofits, philanthropies. There's even a university, at least one university involved because they're a little bit like a think tank there. And neighborhoods is a focus. You have a city like Edmonton, completely different situation. Canada does not have the kind of distressed neighborhoods for the most part that we have in the United States. I'm sure they must exist, but I've not found them in nearly the same scale that we have in many American cities. Edmonton, there was a nonprofit working in one neighborhood simply on this issue of we need to be socially engaged, we need to be neighborly, this is a materially well-off place. Very much thought that something needed to be done to bring people together, to get them out of their house, to be neighborly, be friendly. And the city thought this was important enough. And I don't think everything should be run by cities. I think this work ideally is done best outside of government. But they hired that person, hired a few more staff people, and has an office, literally has an office whose sole role is to boost the social life of people in every neighborhood in the city. And they have you might call it a multi-level approach. There's block leaders, there's neighborhood leaders, there's the staff in the office, there's some website, there's sharing of information, and I think they're still working on metrics and how do they measure that, but they've built a web of people whose main mission is to care for each other, to be responsible for each other and encourage other people block by block to take this mindset. I don't think that's a perfect solution, but again, somebody is sensitive to the need for there to be a better social life, and the best social life that will include everybody is done block by block, house by house. If people don't want to participate, fine, but there you have it. The norms will change, the activities will change, some institutions will change, and hopefully there will be a virtuous cycle in terms of social life in that city. Now, most people, most organizations I'm aware of, I've talked to a lot of people, there are people focused on place, neighborhood economics, religion, different churches in the neighborhood, parish collective. There are people focused on community wealth building. There's people focused on placemaking. There's a whole field around placemaking, mostly public squares. So there's a lot of people thinking about this problem in different ways, but certainly the ideas have not penetrated most parts of our society, and there's not a movement. I would love if we could create a movement where people said, this is important, this is a movement, let's rethink lots of things that we do. But I think you're absolutely correct. People spending transportation money and getting those contracts, they're not very interested in these ideas. People who don't want to change zoning so that your neighbor can have a cafe down the street and there could be some retail closer to your house. There's people not interested in that. You have people in Congress that are not thinking very hard about these issues. They're not being elected or not elected based on these issues. So certainly because of path dependence, we have at least probably going back to the 50s, the whole post-World War II model of development and how we laid out the country. We have 2-3 generations where all this is baked in. So how do we change that? As far as I can see, it needs to be done place by place, and you need to get many more people aware of it, and then gradually build a movement, and hopefully that movement picks up momentum. And again, it's a long road because we've been doing this for so long, in my opinion.
So you've alluded to the fact that fragile neighborhoods can be both the ones that we think of as being poor and having, terrible infrastructure, problems with gun violence, etc., but that we can also have very, very wealthy neighborhoods being fragile. And this, perhaps this difficulty of identifying where that fragility is creates a few interesting conundrums. And one of them is related to perhaps this all-important topic in international development and fragility, which is prevention, and the value of prevention in terms of saving both social and human and economic capital and cost. In your book, you mention marriage as one institution that can help prevent social decay, and you talk about prevention in a few other ways. But how should we think about even identifying at the first step where we should be targeting these prevention efforts and then tailoring them to these places to kind of prevent the social decay and the fragility from setting in the first place? So
as you probably all know, Pathways for Peace, which I worked on, the statistic is $1 of prevention will save $16 later. And I actually quote that statistic in my book. And I talk about prevention. Why are we not building a society that can prevent many of these problems from occurring instead of just we're basically at the bottom of the cliff with the ambulances, and we should be working to help people not fall off the cliff. And ultimately, it's about the wealth of institutions. I mean, marriage is something that you can measure, examine, look at. Family stability, it doesn't have to always be marriage. I think family stability is a broader term that incorporates a broader set of family structures. Clearly marriage is important, but you can have very stable families without marriage. I think it's not as easy, but it's certainly possible. But you also when we talk about the wealth of institutions in a neighborhood, these things are not as easy to measure. Social capital, bonding, bridging social capital. But to the extent that you can do it, I think in distressed neighborhoods, those types of problems are relatively easy to identify because they're coming out in lots of symptoms, lots of problems, whether it's school performance, whether it's real estate prices. You can't really measure collective efficacy, but you could look for signs of it in terms of crime rates, in terms of cleanliness of streets, different problems with gangs or whatever. There's lots of symptoms that are going to be identified in a fragile state. You're ideally looking for the problems before you get to violence. But if you begin to see rising levels of rising, I work on Nigeria. Nigeria has the problem of the Northeast, but you have the problem across the country with gradually rising violence engulfing more and more parts of the country. That's a very good sign that something is fragile there, not necessarily just in the regions that you think there is. So you look for signs like that. I would say for the distressed neighborhoods, you can look for products of fragility that will help you identify. Or you could simply look for key institutions that you would say would need to be in place and need to be working well. And if they're not working well, you have a problem. For materially well-off neighborhoods, it's harder because we're talking about things that may be invisible to the eye. You can certainly look for organizations. An institutional activity among people. There's an organization in Shreveport that I spent some time visiting early on in my research, Community Renewal International, and they aim to, a little bit parallel to what I said about Edmonton, they aim to have every neighborhood thrive, and they appoint block and neighborhood coordinators, and they're as active in wealthy areas as in poor areas. And in the wealthy areas, clearly I've been there. I physically went to a place on a lake, wonderful, nice development. Houses are huge. Those types of houses in near Washington would be $1.5 million or whatever dollars, $2 million. Very, very nice. And yet you go visit people and you hear about nobody talks to each other. No one is out. There's no avenue to meet people. So they have a neighborhood coordinator whose job is to organize activities, to reach out to people, to try to organize things. So the type of things you would be looking for, you're always looking at, for me, ideally, the nature of the institutions, the wealth of institutions, how those institutions are working or not working. But you also could be looking at downstream. You could be, I hate to think that we need to survey because surveys are, you rather have data off the shelf. But in materially well-off neighborhoods, if you saw kids that were depressed, kids that were not spending time with each other, if you saw houses and families in which there was not much interaction, if you saw people who felt that you hear about it. People are well off, they're in a nice neighborhood, but they're afraid to reveal their problems. They're afraid to go call on their neighbor. They're afraid to have their dirty laundry out there on the street, so they end up just buttoning up and hiding at home. When you hear signs like that by talking to people and you see how people spend their time, and you look for institutions and they're saying there's no place-based institutions, and if there is, there's very few of them. They don't overlap, and there's very little interaction. Then I would assume that you have a neighborhood that is nothing but a place with a bunch of houses, and it's not resilient, and it doesn't have any of the social dynamics that I think we do best when we live in those social dynamics. I can speak personally. Your life is more joyful day to day, and you just feel differently. You feel a happiness and a pleasure that you walk on your streets, you walk around your neighborhood, and you feel like it's your place because you know the people. And I could easily give you 5 experiences where something happened where, because I was in this place, in this neighborhood, it made a difference in my family's life.
So I was just thinking as you were speaking about these experiences. There are two things that I remember when one is more recent and one is from when I came to the States. The first, when I came here, you talked about transportation. The idea of having small towns without sidewalks was absolutely shocking. That you would not have, like, you basically, the only way to interact with another human being was if you actually took the car or someone drove you.
Yes.
And then you have to grow up until a certain age to have that autonomy to meet young people as well. It was utterly strange.
The statistic, just to interject, the statistic is that over 90%, 9 out of 10 American neighborhoods are not walkable in the way you might in a big city where we have sidewalks. But I don't know where that data. I know where the data comes from. Emily Talon wrote the book Neighborhoods, but I don't know the source of it. But according to her, over 90% of neighborhoods are not walkable in that way.
And on the positive side, one of the things that truly continues to impress me here is social institutions like Lost and Found. I mean, the fact that you have, yesterday I happened to lose my Metro card. Wasn't a lot of money on my Metro card, but I actually went to the Lost and Found sort of thing where I work, and it was there. Someone had put it there. And this idea, then I can tell you that, this idea that there's this sort of well-intentioned software programmed in our heads, and that we have a society that, or places, as you say, that enable that thing to come up is truly, truly impressive. I wanted to ask you something that you've already alluded to, because you talked about pathways for peace, the UN World Bank report on prevention, which you played an important role. And in our dialogue, when we started speaking, we started from your perspective as someone who works on fragile states, and then how that sort of, you apply that lens to the United States. How would you apply now the lens after your book, what you've learned about American neighborhoods? What would you say to the so-called international policymakers that do development in the fragile states, or to those leaders in those countries? What are some, maybe those operational lessons that you mentioned that could apply there as well?
So, again, for me, the cross-cutting theme that is how I look at things, both in fragile states and in developed countries. And for me, I wouldn't call the United States a fragile state. I do think we have a fragile society in many ways, and for some of the reasons we've discussed today. But in both cases, I think we always need to go back to this point that the success of countries depends upon the nature of relationships. What that means depends upon the country. In some places, I'm working on Libya. The call I had right before we started this interview or this discussion, I'm on the call speaking about Libya. And so my international and domestic worlds, I guess, are merging to some extent in terms of how I go about my day. But later today I'll speak about Ukraine with somebody, and so on and so forth. But I think it needs to be a much greater priority, this challenge of social cohesion, this challenge of building, I would say, not necessarily the state, but what we would call intermediate institutions. In the fragile state world, that means, most importantly, bridging institutions, mechanisms that bring people together across different ethnic, religious geographies, and develop close social ties, common identity, common purpose of helping the country advance. And the more that countries, and some smaller countries are easier to do this or find it easier to do this than larger countries. If you look at Africa, the countries that are working better now, for the most part, are smaller, not larger countries. The Sudans, the Nigerias, the Ethiopias, the DRC, they're struggling partly because they're having more problems building cohesion. The Senegal, the Ghanas, Botswana has always done very well because it's been cohesive from the beginning. Those places are, they have a stronger national identity. They have, partly because of their size, partly because of things involving their culture or their schools or they've had different ways that they have built cohesion. They have built relationships across groups, bridging ties, and that to me is hugely important. And I don't think it's a high priority either of leaders or of developmental or international organizations. And there's lots of practical steps you can do. A simple step is ensure the top universities are bringing together people from across the country, and that or a couple of top high schools, but universities might be easier in a large country, bring people from all parts of this country, the future leaders, and ensure they all study together and make sure that they create those bridging ties when they're young, and find ways to maintain those ties and ensure we're creating cohorts of leaders who think of national purpose, national identity, national goals. You have that in East Asia much more than you have it in Africa or the Middle East. And there's many reasons. I mean, the Middle East and Africa is post-colonial. East Asia, for the most part, their states are built on old, especially Northeast Asia, built on old civilizations. It's different, but to the extent that we can build unified, cohesive groups of leaders who run countries at different levels, a lot of problems will be easier to solve.
So I'm going to ask one last question, and it's about how you end the book. You said you have lessons for all of us, and I'm going to ask you to share with us maybe the top 3 that even us that might not live in fragile communities could adopt. And also to make the case for rethinking the American dream. The American dream has given this country a lot, and even in terms of social cohesion in the past, in a way, because we're all sort of pulling in the same direction. However, how should we maybe reframe it for today so that it can serve us once more?
So I have 2 sets of lessons. I have 3 sets of lessons in my book. At the end of each of my chapters, my practical chapters, what are the takeaways from these chapters? So what are the takeaways to build stronger community? What is the takeaway to build physical places that were more likely for people to have the institutions to thrive? What are the takeaways to build stronger families or family structures? Then I have a chapter in which I have 10 operational lessons. For example, lesson 1 is focus on kids, especially boys, because boys right now are having a lot of problems. I think part of it is that women thrive in networks better than men, and men thrive in structures probably better than women, or at least men need structures more than women. Women can do very well with networks, and our society has moved from structures to networks. I don't say it in those terms, but for example, focus on kids, focus on rethinking government. So there's a series of these lessons. Focus on places. Think strategically about places. Don't focus on all places. There's certain places that we can. This change needs to be incremental. What are the types of places that are ripe for investment to add additional strong neighborhoods, and let's work strategically across the geographies. Those are some examples. But let's get to the last chapter, which I really think is your question is, what can each of us do? Well, first, if you went back to historically the American dream, and this audience likely will not necessarily be very American if I know your audience. What is the Swedish dream? What is the French dream? I'm not sure other countries think of it. I know China is now big on the Chinese dream, Xi Jinping's dream, or what have you. But I don't think most parts of the world think of things that way. But this is certainly a part of American history and American DNA. The original version of the American dream, if you go back and study the history, was not material well-being. It was not a consumerist vision. Today, the American dream seems to be a vision of consuming more. That seems to be what the American dream. Let's get the bigger house. Let's get the bigger car. Let's get whatever fancier this, the fancy vacation. Let's post those photographs for everybody to see. That is our consumer's American dream. But originally, the American dream was more about creating a society in which everybody, wherever they were, could advance. I mean, libraries were an important element in the American dream because it was a way to uplift. So the original American dream was more about how do we uplift people in our society. It wasn't necessarily material at all. I mean, there was clearly a material element, but it was more about uplifting people, enriching people. I mean, there was I think built into that was to some elements of virtue, which is something we don't talk a lot about, but is very important. There was an issue of virtue. There was an issue of education. There was an issue of knowing more about the world and things like that. And so part of what I think is important, not that we want to go back and be poor, and most people used to be poor, and certainly some people still are poor, but I do think we need a broader, less material. Again, for me, well-being is material and social, and we've spent a lot of time and energy on the material. I mean, if you're the World Bank, your job is to eliminate poverty. Your job is not to make strong, socially cohesive. Theoretically, your job is to make effective government, but you don't talk about the social element. Sort of the effective government is just to reduce the poverty. So I mean, the material and the social needs to go side by side. And when I think of the American dream, I think we need to go back more to how it used to be. We need to think about the relational component. We need to think about how our well-being depends upon our place, our relationships. They don't all have to be place-based, but certainly some of them were more likely to be in a thriving set of relationships if at least some of our relationships were place-based. And I'm going to give you four points towards the end of the book that I mentioned. One, of course, is family. I don't think it's talked about as much as it is. Certainly we talk about it to some extent. The more we have strong family ties, whether that means marriage, whether that means children. I mean, this is a bit of a traditional message, but I do think there's lots of data that people are less lonely, more happy. They're actually less poor if they're in a strong family. I mean, one of the best ways to reduce poverty is simply to be in a strong family structure. That doesn't have to be necessarily traditional. It could be multi-generational. I mean, I think marriage is important. It doesn't have to be marriage. I think extended family could be important. One of the organizations I focus on, Thread in Baltimore, they're focused on building what they call Thread families to help ninth grade kids that are doing really bad. The bottom 25% of the kids in Baltimore, they want to take those kids, create a family of volunteers around those kids and give them a 10-year commitment, 24/7, available 24/7 to help. So someone could just volunteer to help one of those kids and be a family member for that person, even if they're not blood relatives. That would be a way to boost family through a more of a nonprofit method. A second thing I talk about is charity and philanthropy. We too often try to help people we don't know, try to think that we're helping the world by sending in a check, doing things that are actually very abstract and don't involve any sweat and tears, to be very honest. And the best way to help people actually is to roll up your sleeves, get involved in some organization, get involved in some place. And so, for example, I'm on the board of an organization that helps children that would not normally be in a school. And the organization has an integration method where they try not to separate children like with Down syndrome or other ADHD, help those kids get into school. And that organization is not completely my neighborhood, but a lot of the board members and kids are from my neighborhood. When I go to have a meeting on the strategic plan on Sunday night, it's walking distance from my home, and probably half the people attending will walk there. And so when we talk about charity and philanthropy, we really ought to be thinking about this: is what can we be doing in terms of actually helping people we know, or helping the place that we know, and doing things that actually means that we're embedded in relationships, we're possibly on committees, we're possibly volunteering our time, not one-offs, but regularly, in terms of organizational places thrive because they're wealthy. They have a wealth of organizations. What can you do in terms of your charity and philanthropy to contribute to the organizations in your neighborhood? When we think of patriotism and we think of political engagement, patriotism today is military service or go off to Washington. Patriotism was a long time ago about investing in your place. That I'm talking 100 years ago. I'm not talking recently. Everything has been nationalized, as I think Paul mentioned at some point. It's partly the changes in our economy and government and media and whatnot, universities and whatnot. But even political engagement. How involved are we in our local politics? How involved are we in things that we actually can try to make a difference? Why are we always involved in things that are very abstract, far away? And why do we, I mean, not that these causes aren't important, but why not focus on a cause that you actually could see yourself being a major player in and making a major difference? I mean, if you go to a small town, if you move to a small town, that's what people end up doing. They actually can make a difference. But we could do that all wherever we live. Could be a civic association. And the last point I talk about is, it's a bit of overlap, but social engagement. We spend far too much time. It's interesting. I'm in this neighborhood where I know a lot of my neighbors. I can walk up and down the street and I can literally tell you who lives in every house. When my daughter dropped her younger brother many years ago, and he was probably 2 years old, and he fell on his chin and it was all bloody, my wife didn't even ask anyone for help. She simply picked up the kid and took off down the street. And I was like, what is she doing? Where is she going? Because she knew exactly where every nurse was in the neighborhood. So she went to the closest nurse. So when we talk about social engagement, it's very much about, should we belong somehow to what's around us? What can we do that will, we shouldn't be, I mean, social media is great, but getting involved again in politics is great. But if we are involved personally in things that we can be engaged with, we will see a difference much easier. We will be much less, we'll have different types of frustration, but if we really work at it, we will be able to see progress being made and our contribution being valued, and we will end up with relationships that we would never have before, and I think we'll be better off for doing so, as well as our place will be better off. And the real goal here is, if each of us took those steps, we would create a more virtuous pattern where it was the norm that we did those things, and not just get on Twitter and shout and send in our check and scream at election time, which is all wonderful, but I think very unproductive.
Thank you so much. And you said, I have two comments. You mentioned the potential for the family, your perspective on the family to be interpreted as a more traditional view. But I'm also familiar with research, which you might also be familiar with, that men that are in relationships actually live longer than single men.
Yes, for sure. Men, to be honest, it's the men who need the relationships
exactly.
more than, I mean, the women need it because they're poor. They're much poorer sometimes. But in terms of relational health, the boys need the fathers and the men need the families much more than the other way around.
And what I found funny was that the same study, I think, also said that women live about the same or a little less if they're married.
Well, I haven't seen the negative part, but I'm quite familiar with the fact that men and boys...
gotta get fact-checked on this, but I know that men and boys do much better, especially boys that are brought up in stable household, in whatever shape that household is, if it has two parents in the house.
Yes, there's huge amount of data on children doing much better, but especially boys in stable households with the fathers. And I mean, there's some people who say that the point of marriage is to tie the men down and force them to live more virtuous lives. And longer. The point is, it helps them live longer lives. But they act differently, and the point is, if you don't tie them down, they act in ways that are not for their own well-being. But by tying them down, they're forced to act in a different way, and they themselves benefit tremendously from that. But it may not be their natural orientation. They're naturally oriented to run away and just
natural instincts.
Just whatever they do. We won't talk about whatever they do.
Exactly. That evolution puts some drives in.
I mean, I think it's somehow built. I'm sure if you studied the pre-humans, I bet it's somehow built into. And certainly, not every man is like that. I know plenty of men who do quite well. But we're talking about averages here. We're talking about averages.
And
there are bad marriages. There are bad marriages that certainly people want to escape from. But we're talking on average here about the benefits to
population
people.
level.
Population level averages, just to clarify, for those who might disagree.
And then the other thing I was thinking as you were wrapping up, what you're technically saying is we need to get back what we used to have. I was thinking of Tocqueville's observation, right, in Democracy in America, about the robust institutions and the instincts for civil society that he saw here in the U.S. and the ability to organize the community level. So we need to get that back in an updated and even better form, ultimately.
Yes.
So I recommend everybody grab this book, read it, because if we don't address the fragilities before they expand, if we don't engage in prevention, it's much costlier, both at a human cost level as well as economic cost, to address it once it spreads. So Seth, it was such a pleasure to speak with you today. And can you let everyone know where they can find you online and where they can get your book?
Okay, so in terms of online, well, of course, they can always reach out to me if they have specific questions. I'm most active in terms of social media on LinkedIn. I'm working very hard on LinkedIn these days, and it's incredible how many people reach out to me, and they're literally sending me ideas and places that I should look into, which I find very useful. It makes me think I need to have a follow-up book with all these other ideas. But I'm learning about what they did in Washington State, and I'm learning what someone's doing in parts of Western Michigan, and so on and so forth. So that's great. So you can always find me on LinkedIn. And but in terms of my book, the book is coming out on October 17. And assuming that we're publishing this before October 17, the book is out October 17th. It's on all major sites that you can buy the books, but the easiest, of course, is Amazon. But you can go to Barnes & Noble. You can go to the publisher's website. You can do any of the above. You can find me on my own website, sethkaplan.org. Sethkaplan.org will give you blurbs to the book. It'll give you some overview of the book. It'll give you some articles that I've written on this subject and other material. And hopefully this discussion and the website will motivate you to go buy that book. Please go buy that book.
Yes.
But more than just buy the book,
read the book.
Please read the book and think how it should impact what you're doing professionally and personally. I wrote this book with the idea that, nobody's paying me to write this book. I wrote this book. I worked many years on it because I would like us professionally and personally to think really hard what the ideas in the book mean for your personal life, your professional goals, what your organization is working on, anything that you can take away and use. I will feel that I've spent my time wisely over these many years. So thank you. And I would love to hear from everybody. How did you change your life, or what did you do differently in your organization based upon what you read in the book? I would love to hear from everybody who had the chance to actually do something based upon my book. Thank you so much.
That is wonderful. We're going to put all those links in the description just below. And to our audience, thank you so much for tuning into After All, the Fragility podcast. We hope you found our conversation with Seth interesting and inspirational. We definitely did. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you want to know more about us, about F-World, please visit our website at f-world.org and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at F-World Podcast. Thanks so much for listening.